Alice in the Nightmare Maze. Chapter 1. The Fall into the Maze. The Alice had always been a curious girl, and on that fateful day, it was her curiosity that led her astray. The fall noon sun was warm, and the air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers as she wandered through the meadow. The fall peace was shattered when she caught sight of something strange, a white rabbit, dressed in a waistcoat, running frantically through the tall grass. The oddness of the scene intrigued her, and without a second thought, she decided to follow. The foal darted through the meadow, glancing nervously over its shoulder as if sensing her pursuit. Alice quickened her pace, nearly tripping over the hem of her dress as she struggled to keep up. The foal was fast, but Alice's determination was stronger. She followed it through a thicket of trees until they reached a large, gnarled oak with a hollow at its base. The foal, without hesitation, the rabbit dove into the darkness of the hollow. The foal hesitated only for a moment before plunging in after him. The foal hollow was much deeper than she expected, and before she could react, she found herself falling. The foal air rushed past her, pulling her hair upwards and leaving her breathless. The foal seemed to last an eternity, the walls around her a blur of shadows and indistinct shapes. The foal, she landed with a soft thud on a cold, damp surface. The foal here was thick and musty, carrying a faint metallic scent that made her skin crawl. The foal Alice sat up slowly, her body aching from the fall, and looked around. She was no longer in the hollow of a tree, nor was she in any place that seemed remotely familiar. The full room she found herself in was vast, with ceilings so high they disappeared into darkness. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, twisted and distorted, as if the stone itself had been tortured into these nightmarish shapes. The floor was uneven, made of jagged stones that seemed to jut out at odd angles. A single door stood at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, emitting a faint, flickering light. Alice rose to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. As she moved toward the door, the room seemed to close in on her, the walls shifting subtly, as if alive. The full carvings seemed to writhe, their shapes changing in the corner of her eye, but returning to their original forms when she looked directly at them. The full to shake off the unease that settled in her chest, but it clung to her like a cold, damp fog. The full door, she paused. The flickering light beyond was unsettling, casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the threshold. She could hear faint whispers, echoing from the corridor beyond, though she couldn't make out the words. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open wider and stepped through. The corridor was narrow and seemed to stretch on infinitely in both directions. The walls were lined with old, rusted lanterns that flickered weakly, barely illuminating the path. The falls grew louder as she ventured further, their tones alternating between soft, coaxing murmurs and harsh, mocking laughter. The full air grew colder with each step, and Alice couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she walked, she noticed strange markings on the wall, symbols and words written in a language she didn't understand, but that filled her with an inexplicable dread. The full corridor twisted and turned in unnatural ways, leading her deeper into the unknown. At times, she thought she saw movement in the shadows, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. After what felt like hours of walking, Alice reached a large chamber at the end of the corridor. The chamber was circular, with a high domed ceiling that was cracked and crumbling. The center of the room stood a tall, ornate mirror. The full surface was tarnished, but as Alice approached, she saw her reflection staring back at her with wide, frightened eyes. The full thing was wrong. The reflection didn't mirror her movements exactly. The full laid, as if her image was trapped in time, or worse, something else was imitating her. The full stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. The full reflection's expression changed, its eyes narrowing with malevolent intent. The full she could react, the mirror's surface rippled, and the reflection reached out, its hand pushing through the glass as if it were water. Alice stumbled back in horror, but the hand grabbed her wrist with icy fingers, pulling her toward the mirror. The full surged through her as she struggled against the grip, but it was too strong. The reflection, now fully emerged from the mirror, was no longer a perfect copy of her. The folds were twisted, its smile a grotesque mockery of her own. With a final desperate yank, it pulled her into the mirror, and Alice was plunged into darkness. Chapter 2. The full party of horrors. When Alice opened her eyes, she found herself lying on a cold stone floor. The full oppressive darkness of the mirror had vanished, replaced by the dim glow of candles. She was in a new room, smaller and more confined than the previous one, with walls lined by towering shelves filled with dusty, ancient books. The air was thick with the smell of wax and decay, and the silence was so profound that even her own breathing seemed too loud. The full stood and dusted herself off. She noticed a narrow wooden door on the opposite side of the room. The full was ajar, and beyond it, she could hear faint voices, soft, but unmistakably eerie. The fulls were singing, a strange, disjointed melody that sent chills down her spine. The full other option, she cautiously approached the door and pushed it open. The full door beyond was short and led to a wide open space, a courtyard of sorts, bathed in the sickly light of a full moon. The full center of the courtyard stood a long, decrepit table, set for a tea party. The full cloth was tattered and stained, the porcelain teapots chipped and cracked, and the teacups filled with a dark, thick liquid that smelled of rot. The table sat several figures, their faces hidden in shadow, their forms slouched and motionless. The full hesitated at the threshold, but a sudden creak from behind her urged her forward. The full through which she had entered slammed shut with a force that echoed through the courtyard, leaving her no choice but to move toward the table. The full did. The figures around it began to stir. The first to move was a tall, thin man at the head of the table. He wore a large top hat that obscured most of his face, but from beneath its brim, Alice could see a pair of glinting eyes watching her intently. The full's the Mad Hatter, but he was not the whimsical character she had imagined. The full's movements were jerky, almost mechanical, as he slowly lifted a teacup to his lips and took a sip. The full dripped from the corner of his mouth, staining his already soiled clothing. Next, the figure to his right turned its head, a hair, or what was left of one. The full fur was patchy and matted, its eyes sunken and hollow. It clutched a teapot in its gnarled paws, but instead of pouring tea, it allowed the dark liquid to spill onto the table, creating a pool that dripped off the edges like blood. Alice's heart raced as she took a step back, but before she could retreat, the Mad Hatter spoke. "Welcome, welcome, dear Alice," he rasped, his voice a low, unsettling drawl. "The full, we've been expecting you." The full words were slow, deliberate, each syllable dragged out as if it pained him to speak. The full figures around the table began to murmur in agreement, their voices overlapping in a discordant chorus. "The full do join us," the Hatter continued, gesturing to an empty chair at the far end of the table. "The full, often we have such lively company." The full wanted to refuse, to run as far away from this nightmarish scene as possible, but something compelled her to move forward. The full could feel the eyes of the Hatter and his guests on her, a palpable pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The full trembling hands, she pulled out the chair and sat down. The moment she did, the figures around the table straightened, their heads snapping toward her in unison. The Hatter clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and jarring in the otherwise silent courtyard. "The full," he bellowed, his voice now brimming with manic energy. The hair responded instantly, lifting the teapot and pouring the thick, black liquid into Alice's cup. The full was overpowering, like death and decay. "Drink," the Hatter urged, leaning forward eagerly. "The full special brew, just for you." The full stared at the cup, her stomach turning at the thought of what might be inside. The full liquid bubbled slightly, as if alive, and a faint, grotesque face seemed to form on its surface before dissolving back into the dark depths. The full, "Think I'll pass," Alice stammered, trying to push the cup away, but the Hatter's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "The full, but you must," he insisted, his eyes gleaming with a sick excitement. "It's rude to refuse hospitality." The full other figures around the table began to nod vigorously, their heads bobbing up and down in a grotesque parody of agreement. The full eyes, now fully visible, were empty, voids of darkness that bore into Alice's soul. The full, Alice pulled her hand free from the Hatter's grasp and knocked the cup off the table. The full shattered on the ground, and the liquid spread out like an inky stain, seeping into the cracks in the stone. For a moment, everything was still. The full Hatter laughed, a high, piercing sound that echoed through the courtyard and made Alice's blood run cold. Very well, he said, leaning back in his chair. No need to be so dramatic. I do hope you enjoyed the show. The folk, the figures around the table began to crumble. The skin cracked and flaked away, revealing the brittle bones beneath. They collapsed, their bodies disintegrating into piles of dust and ash. The remained, grinning madly at Alice, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. Find that things are rarely what they seem here, dear Alice, he said, his voice now a whisper. The party is only the beginning. Before Alice could respond, the Hatter's figure flickered and faded, as if he were nothing more than a mirage. The dissolved around her, the walls and ground melting away into darkness. And Alice was alone, cold black void pressing in from all sides. This time she felt a presence, something lurking in the shadows, watching her, waiting for the next move. Chapter 3. The Cheshire Cat's laughter. The darkness around Alice seemed impenetrable, a thick void that swallowed everything. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she struggled to keep calm. The fury of the Mad Hatter's tea party still clung to her, but there was no time to dwell on it. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out of this nightmare. She began to walk, her hands outstretched in front of her, feeling for any obstacles. The ground beneath her feet was uneven and cold, like the surface of a forgotten tomb. Had no idea where she was going, only that standing still was not an option. After what felt like an eternity, Alice saw a faint light in the distance, a dim flickering glow that barely cut through the darkness. For any sense of direction, she moved toward it. Got closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the outline of a narrow path lined with gnarled, twisted trees. The trees loomed over her, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The was dark and cracked, and from the knots and hollows in their trunks strange, whispering voices emanated. The path wound through the forest like a serpent, twisting and turning in ways that made Alice's head spin. The at the end of the path was her only beacon, and she had no choice but to follow it. The whispers grew louder, filling her ears with their insidious murmurings. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakably malicious. Every now and then, she caught snippets of words, her name, fragments of sentences that made her blood run cold. Whenever she tried to focus on them, they would fade away, leaving her disoriented and frightened. The path seemed to stretch on endlessly, but eventually, Alice emerged from the forest into a small clearing. The center of the clearing was a large ancient tree, its branches barren and twisted like the claws of some monstrous creature. Hanging from one of the branches was a lantern, the source of the flickering light that had guided her. The swayed gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. As Alice approached it, she noticed something strange, a pair of glowing eyes watching her from the darkness beneath the tree. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, as the eyes slowly rose higher and higher until they were level with her own. The appeared next, a wide, sharp-toothed grin that seemed to float in the air, disembodied and unnerving. The grin moved closer, revealing the figure of the Cheshire Cat, though this was not the playful creature Alice remembered from the stories. His fur was matted and dark, blending into the shadows, and his eyes gleamed with a malevolent intelligence. "Lost are we?" the Cheshire Cat purred, his voice smooth and mocking. The grin widened, showing more of those sharp, gleaming teeth. The perhaps just found in the wrong place. Alice swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. Am I? How do I get out of here? The Cheshire Cat tilted his head, as if pondering her question. His eyes never left hers, glowing like embers in the night. Dear Alice, there's no simple way out. Not from here. The place has a way of keeping those it ensnares. To be away, Alice insisted, her desperation growing. Stay here. To get back. The Cheshire Cat chuckled, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. To where? The place you came from is gone, Alice. The world you knew is but a distant memory, fading with every step you take in this labyrinth. The foal felt a pang of hopelessness, but she refused to give in. "I won't believe that. There must be a way out, and I will find it." The foal cat's grin twisted into something more sinister. The foal's, "Perhaps not. But tell me, Alice, what are you willing to sacrifice to find your way out?" The foal question hung in the air, heavy with ominous implications. Alice opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. The Cheshire Cat's grin grew wider, as if he had expected her silence. "No answer?" The foal, "No matter. The foal maze has its own designs, and you'll find out soon enough." The foal began to fade, his body disappearing into the shadows, leaving only his eyes and grin. The foal, "Beware, Alice. Not all paths lead to salvation. The foal far worse than the nightmares you've already seen." The foal, the Cheshire Cat vanished completely, leaving Alice alone in the clearing. The foal continued to sway, casting its feeble light, but it provided little comfort. Alice felt more lost than ever, the weight of the Cheshire Cat's words pressing down on her like a suffocating fog. The foal knew she had to keep moving, but the path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and every step felt like a step further into despair. The forest loomed around her, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. The foal took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward, her heart heavy with fear but resolute in her determination to find a way out. The foal in the back of her mind, the Cheshire Cat's laughter echoed, a reminder that in this twisted maze, nothing was ever as it seemed. Chapter 4. The Queen's Dark Castle. The forest's oppressive atmosphere clung to Alice as she pressed on, the shadows twisting and writhing around her as if alive. The path she followed seemed to change with every step, the trees bending and stretching into grotesque shapes, their branches clawing at the sky like the fingers of the damned. Yet, despite the overwhelming dread that gnawed at her insides, Alice continued forward, driven by the faint hope that an end to this nightmare existed. After what felt like hours, the forest began to thin, the trees becoming fewer and farther between. The fall grew colder, the ground beneath her feet transitioning from the uneven dirt and roots to smooth, hard stone. The foal realized with a sinking heart that she was approaching another part of this accursed labyrinth. The path opened up into a wide expanse, and there, looming before her, was a massive castle. The castle was an imposing structure, its dark spires reaching into the stormy sky, where clouds swirled like a maelstrom. The walls were made of black stone, slick with moisture and etched with strange arcane symbols that pulsed with a faint red glow. The fall surrounded the castle, but instead of water, it was filled with a thick black liquid that bubbled and hissed ominously. The drawbridge was down, leading directly into the yawning maw of the castle's entrance. Alice hesitated at the edge of the drawbridge, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, to flee from this place of palpable evil. The foal, no going back. The foal knew that, and with a deep, steadying breath, she stepped onto the drawbridge and crossed over into the castle. The foal's hall was vast and cold, with high ceilings and walls lined with ancient tapestries depicting scenes of horror, battles, executions, and other unspeakable acts of violence. The foal was heavy with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the echo of her footsteps on the stone floor. As she ventured deeper into the castle, the oppressive silence was broken by a faint, rhythmic thumping, like the beating of a massive, diseased heart. The foal led her to a grand staircase, its steps worn and cracked from centuries of use. The thumping grew louder as she ascended, reverberating through the walls and floor, as if the very castle was alive and breathing. At the top of the stairs, she found herself facing a pair of enormous doors, made of the same black stone as the walls, with intricate carvings of twisted faces and tortured souls. The foal seemed to pulse in time with the beating, as if they too were alive. The foal reached out and pushed the doors open, and they groaned on their hinges, revealing a vast throne room. The full room was bathed in a sickly red light that emanated from a large blood-red crystal suspended from the ceiling. The floor was made of polished black marble, and the walls were lined with grotesque statues, their eyes following her every move. At the far end of the room, seated upon a throne of twisted iron and bone, was the Queen of Hearts. The Queen was a terrifying figure, her presence filling the room with an aura of malevolence. The full and gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones, her eyes a deep, burning red. Her dress was made of black velvet, adorned with crimson jewels that shimmered like blood. In her hand, she held a long scepter topped with a heart-shaped gem that pulsed with a dark, ominous light. The Foals entered the room. Queen's gaze locked onto her, and a cruel smile curled her lips. "The Foal, you finally arrived, little Alice," the Queen hissed, her voice a cold, venomous whisper that echoed through the throne room. "I've been expecting you." The Foal followed hard, forcing herself to stand tall despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "The Foal to find a way out of this place," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I won't let you stop me." The Foal Queen's laughter filled the room, a harsh, grating sound that sent shivers down Alice's spine. "The Foal, dear child, you still don't understand, do you? There is no escape from this place. You are mine now, just like all the others who dared to challenge me." As she spoke, the walls of the throne room began to shift and writhe, revealing the faces of countless souls trapped within the stone. The Foals were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams, their agony a testament to the Queen's power. The sight was horrifying, but Alice refused to look away. The Foal didn't allow herself to be intimidated. "The Foal, you take me," Alice declared, her voice gaining strength as she clenched her fists. "I'll fight you if I have to." The Foal rose from her throne, towering over Alice as she approached. The Foal in her hand glowed brighter, casting eerie shadows across the room. "The Foal, you are nothing but a foolish child," the Queen sneered, her voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can defy me? The Foal, ruler of this domain, and you will bow before me." The Foal's sudden violent motion, the Queen raised her scepter and slammed it into the ground. The floor beneath Alice's feet cracked and split open, sending shockwaves through the room. From the fissures, dark, twisted vines emerged, writhing and curling toward Alice like the tentacles of some monstrous creature. She barely had time to react as the vines lashed out, wrapping around her ankles and wrists, pulling her toward the gaping chasm that had opened in the floor. The Foal struggled against the vines, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought to break free. The Queen watched with a cruel smile, her eyes burning with sadistic pleasure. "The Foal, child? The Foal is futile. You belong to me now." The Foal wasn't ready to give up. The Foal, her strength, she wrenched one hand free and reached for the knife she had found earlier, hidden beneath her dress. The Foal lashed at the vines, cutting through them with fierce determination. The Foal's smile faltered as Alice freed herself, stumbling back to her feet. "You will not control me," Alice spat, her voice filled with defiance. The Foal find a way out of here, no matter what. The Queen's eyes narrowed, her expression darkening with rage. "The Foal, insolent little wretch," she hissed, raising her scepter again. "If you will not submit, then you will die." The Foal could strike. Alice lunged forward, her knife aimed at the Queen's heart. The Foal's reaction was swift, but not swift enough. The Foal pierced her chest, and for a moment, Queen's eyes widened in shock. The Foal, to Alice's horror, Queen began to laugh, a deep guttural laugh that echoed through the throne room. "You think you can kill me?" Queen mocked, her voice growing more distorted with every word. "The Foal, I am eternal, and you are nothing." The Foal's form began to warp and twist, her body dissolving into a swirling mass of shadows and darkness. The Foal clattered to the floor as the Queen's laughter grew louder, more frenzied. The Foal room shook violently, the walls cracking and crumbling as the Queen's dark power surged. The Foal stumbled back, her mind racing as she tried to comprehend what was happening. The Queen's voice echoed all around her, filling her with a sense of overwhelming dread. But even as the darkness closed in, Alice refused to give in to fear. She looked around desperately for an escape, her eyes landing on the scepter that lay abandoned on the floor. The Foal-shaped gem still pulsed with that ominous light, but now it seemed almost within reach. The Foal darted forward and grabbed the scepter, feeling a surge of energy course through her as she lifted it. The Foal's laughter faltered, and for a brief moment, Alice saw fear in those burning red eyes. The Foal, her strength, Alice raised the scepter and slammed it into the ground, just as the Queen had done. The light from the gem flared brilliantly, blindingly, as the throne room was consumed by a blinding flash of red light. The walls of the castle trembled, the twisted statues cracking and shattering, the faces of the trapped souls dissolving into the ether. The full queen's scream of rage and pain filled the air, reverberating through the collapsing structure. The fall beneath Alice's feet began to give way, and she felt herself falling once again, falling into the endless void, with the queen's final furious cry echoing in her ears. Chapter 5. The Final Battle. The fall through the void, her senses overwhelmed by the darkness and the echoing remnants of the queen's scream. It felt as though she was tumbling through an endless abyss, with no sense of up or down, of time or space. The fall as the sensation became unbearable, a sudden jarring impact knocked the breath from her lungs, and the darkness around her began to recede. She found herself lying on a cold, hard surface, her body aching from the fall. The falling softly, Alice pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, blinking as her surroundings slowly came into focus. The fall was in another part of the castle, though this place was different, ominously so. The fall she had landed in was circular, with high vaulted ceilings and walls of polished obsidian that reflected the flickering light of the torches mounted along the walls. The center of the room was a large circular platform, elevated slightly above the rest of the floor. The full heart of the platform stood the Queen of Hearts, her form restored to its former terrifying glory. Something had changed. Queen's eyes, once burning with malevolent power, now flickered with a mix of fury and desperation. Stay down, Alice, the Queen hissed, her voice a venomous snarl. You cannot defeat me. This is my world, my domain, and I will see you crushed beneath my heel. The foal climbed to her feet, her hand still gripping the scepter she had taken from the Queen. The foal weapon felt comforting, and she could sense the power it held, humming just beneath the surface. Even with the scepter, Alice knew that this would be no easy fight. The foal had the advantage. This was her realm, and she would not give it up without a struggle. The reign ends here, Queen, Alice declared, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. I will find a way out of this nightmare, and you won't stop me. The Queen's lips curled into a sneer, and with a flick of her wrist, she summoned a wave of darkness that surged toward Alice like a tidal wave. The foal barely had time to react, raising the scepter just in time to deflect the attack. The darkness slammed into the scepter, dissipating with a loud crackle of energy, but the force of the impact sent Alice stumbling back. Nothing but a foolish child, the Queen spat, her voice reverberating through the chamber. Think you can wield my power against me? Sorely mistaken. Full of rage, Queen unleashed a flurry of attacks, each one more brutal and relentless than the last. The tendrils lashed out from the shadows, seeking to ensnare Alice and drag her into the abyss. The floor beneath her feet cracked and split open, jagged spikes of obsidian erupting from the ground, threatening to impale her. Alice moved with desperate agility, dodging and deflecting the Queen's onslaught as best she could. The Queen's power was overwhelming, and each strike left her weaker, more exhausted. The chamber seemed to close in around her, the walls warping and twisting, reflecting the chaos of the battle. In the midst of the maelstrom, Alice heard a familiar voice, faint but clear. Was the Cheshire cat's laughter, echoing through her mind, taunting her. Remember, Alice, not all paths lead to salvation. Some are far worse than the nightmares you've already seen. The word sent a chill down Alice's spine, but they also sparked something deep within her, a determination, a refusal to be beaten. Couldn't give up now. She wouldn't. Queen prepared another devastating attack. Alice noticed something, a small faint crack in the Queen's composure. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Was not as invincible as she seemed. With resolve, Alice tightened her grip on the scepter and charged forward, dodging the tendrils of darkness and leaping over the jagged spikes. The Queen's eyes widened in surprise as Alice closed the distance between them, raising the scepter high. As powerful as you think. Alice shouted, her voice filled with defiance. Brought the scepter down with all her strength, aiming directly at the Queen's chest. The act sent a shockwave through the chamber, the ground trembling beneath their feet. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the Queen let out a scream of agony, her form flickering and distorting. The power within the scepter surged, and Alice could feel it resonating with the Queen's own energy, the two forces clashing violently. The Queen's scream grew louder, more distorted, as the scepter's power began to tear her apart from within. The darkness that had filled the chamber began to recede, the walls cracking and crumbling as the Queen's hold on the realm weakened. "The foe cannot win," the foe gasped, her voice fading as her form continued to unravel. The foe is not the end." The final desperate effort, Alice drove the scepter deeper into the Queen's chest. The foe's form shattered, dissolving into a cloud of dark mist that was quickly swept away by the wind. The full chamber around Alice began to collapse, the walls crumbling into dust, the floor disintegrating beneath her feet. The foe felt herself falling once again, but this time, the darkness did not consume her. Instead, she was enveloped by a warm golden light, the same light she had seen flickering in the distance when she first entered the labyrinth. The full light grew brighter, washing away the last remnants of the Queen's nightmare world. With a sudden jolt, Alice was back in the real world. The foe found herself lying on the grass in the middle of the meadow, the afternoon sun shining down on her, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. For a moment, she lay there, staring up at the clear blue sky, trying to process what had just happened. The foe felt so surreal, like a terrible dream. But as she sat up and looked around, she knew it had been real. The memory of the labyrinth, the horrors she had faced, and the Queen's final words lingered in her mind. She was free, but the experience had left its mark on her. She was not the same girl who had chased the white rabbit into the unknown. As she stood and dusted herself off, Alice noticed something glinting in the grass beside her. The full scepter, its once dark gem now clear and shimmering with a soft, golden light. The foe picked it up, feeling a strange sense of comfort as she held it in her hands. The foe knew that the nightmare was over, but the journey had changed her. She was stronger now, more resilient, and though the memory of the labyrinth would haunt her, she would not let it define her. With a final glance at the meadow, Alice turned and began to walk toward home, the scepter still clutched in her hand. She didn't know what the future held, but she was ready to face it, whatever it might be. Chapter 6. Return to the real world. The foe walked through the familiar countryside, the sunlight warming her face and the gentle breeze brushing through her hair. The folder, though now a mere shadow of its former power, still shimmered faintly in her hand as she held it close. Every step, the haunting memories of the labyrinth and the Queen's dark realm began to fade, replaced by the comforting sights and sounds of the world she once knew. But even as she walked along the familiar path, a subtle tension lingered, a feeling that the nightmare had left an indelible mark on her soul. She approached the edge of the woods that bordered her home. She paused for a moment, looking back at the path she had traveled. The trees stood tall and unmoving, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. No sign of the twisted, nightmarish forest she had encountered in the labyrinth. The foes she had faced were gone, but they had not disappeared. They were buried deep within her, memories that would never fully leave her. The forest where she lived with her family came into view, nestled in a small clearing surrounded by wildflowers. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. A scene of peace and tranquility, a stark contrast to the chaos and terror she had endured. The foe approached the door. She hesitated, feeling a strange sense of unease. Everything truly be the same? Be able to return to her life as it was before? Alice pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm, inviting atmosphere of the cottage greeted her, the familiar creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot, the soft glow of the fire in the hearth. Her mother was in the kitchen, humming softly to herself as she prepared supper, while her father sat in his chair by the fire, reading a book. As if nothing had changed, as if the nightmare had never happened. Here, her mother called, turning to smile at her. Where have you been? Gone for hours. We were beginning to worry. Alice opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Could she explain what she had been through? How could she make them understand the horrors she had faced? Instead, she simply smiled and shook her head. "I'm sorry, Mother," Alice said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I got a bit lost, but I'm fine now." Her mother's smile faltered slightly as she looked at her daughter, sensing something different in her demeanor. But she chose not to press further, instead turning back to her work. The foal, well, I'm glad you're home. The foal will be ready soon. The foal nodded and made her way to her room. The scepter still felt warm in her hand, a reminder of the power she had wielded, the battles she had fought. The foal stood carefully on her bed and stood there for a moment, staring at it. The full events of the labyrinth seemed like a distant memory now, but the scepter was proof that it had been real, too real. The foal went to the mirror in her room, half expecting to see the twisted reflection she had encountered in the queen's castle. The foal face that looked back at her was her own, though there was something in her eyes, a hardness, a weariness that hadn't been there before. The foal was different now, changed by the horrors she had faced. But she was also stronger, more resilient, and she knew she would never be the same innocent girl who had chased after a white rabbit. The foal, she stared into the mirror, a faint, ghostly image of the Cheshire cat's grin flickered in the glass. The foal there for only a moment, then it was gone, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The foal of his mocking laughter echoed in her mind, a reminder that the world was full of mysteries, some wonderful, some terrible. The foal had faced both. The foal sighed and turned away from the mirror. The foal fully wrapped the scepter in a piece of cloth and placed it in a small chest by her bed. The foal, relic of a nightmare she would rather forget, but she knew she couldn't. The foal, part of her now, just as the labyrinth and the queen were a part of her story. She lay down on her bed, feeling the familiar comfort of the blankets around her. The foal sighed. The evening sky was painted in hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. The full world outside was peaceful, serene, but Alice knew that beneath the surface, there were other worlds, dark, twisted places where nightmares roamed. The full sleep began to take her. Alice wondered what her future would hold. The full be able to live a normal life after everything she had seen? Or would the memories of the labyrinth haunt her forever? She didn't know the answer, but she was determined to face whatever came her way. The full, now, she was home. She was safe. The full, and that was enough. The full, as her eyes closed and sleep claimed her, a single thought lingered in her mind. The labyrinth was gone, but it had left a door open in her soul, a door that might one day open again, leading her back into the nightmare. The full, that day ever came, she knew she would be ready. The end. The full enjoyed this video. Please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. The full, thank you for your attention.